The Isle of Pelisse, Part 6. The Battle of Fernberg Farm. On the 29th of May, King Ludwig, lord of the lands between the lakes, suffered a calamitous defeat at the Battle of Hyale. The following day, the ragged remnants of his army were retreating rapidly back the way they had come. As his carriage rattled along the road, King Ludwig spent his time bemoaning his bad luck, staring vacantly out of the window, and reluctantly writing a letter to his wife, Queen Ophelia, asking her to urgently send him military assistance. On 1st June, his army recrossed the South Stream and entered Southbridge. If King Ludwig was depressed, Florian the Fair, Grand Duke of the Far Lands, the victor of Hyale, was in a much better mood. He allowed his men a well-earned day of rest, after which he and the bulk of his army marched after King Ludwig. The exception was the 2nd Rifle Company, which was given the unenviable task of remaining behind on the battlefield in order to bury the dead. Meanwhile, Queen Ophelia was still in cautious pursuit of the fleeing Earl of Westwood. Hoping to throw the Queen off his trail, and thus buy himself some much-needed time, the Earl and the Westwood Horse Guards, who were his only escort, left the road that they had been following and headed deep into the forest to the north of Woodlands, hoping to hole up in a remote valley at the foot of the mountain known as the Fernberg. If the Earl had been travelling alone, this manoeuvre might well have been rewarded with success. As it was, the skilled scouts of the 1st Hildemede Hussars had no difficulty in finding the rather obvious tracks left by a squadron of heavy cavalry. Thus it was that, as King Ludwig was rolling dejectedly into Southbridge, his queen, still unaware of the humiliation that her husband had suffered at Hyale, was leading her army along a forested track up a valley toward the Earl's hiding place. At the head of the Queen's force rode the 1st and 2nd squadrons of the Hildemede Hussars. Behind them trotted the Queen's Dragoon Guards, and the infantry of the Woodlands Foresters marched at the rear. Out of the trees rode Ophelia's horsemen, onto a high pasture scattered with sheep and surrounded by bleak hillsides, beyond which the mighty mountain of the Fernberg reared its majestic head. The track continued across the open ground, terminating at an isolated huddle of rough-built stone buildings. This last outpost of civilization was Fernberg Farm, and before it were arrayed the serried ranks of the Westwood Horse Guards. The Earl had learned of Ophelia's approach. He was heavily outnumbered, and his position appeared to be hopeless. But he was not going to quietly surrender. He was a man of honour. He was going to fight. Ophelia ordered her troops to deploy into battle formation. At the front she placed her cavalry, in line, the Queen's Dragoon Guards in the centre, with a squadron of the Hildemede Hussars on each flank. Behind the cavalry was a line of infantry, blocking the Earl of Westwood's path should he manage to evade the horsemen and attempt to escape back down the track and into the trees. But the Earl of Westwood showed no sign of trying to escape. He instructed the Westwood Horse Guards to follow the example of their foes and form into line, and then to hold position and await developments. They did not have to wait very long. Bugles sounded, and on the left of Ophelia's line, the 2nd Hildemede Hussars galloped across the grass and crashed into the Westwood Horse Guards. The Westwood Horse Guards held their line and drove the Hussars back. But even as the Hussars recoiled, more bugles sounded, and now the Queen's Dragoon Guards came thundering along the track. To their right followed the 1st Hildemede Hussars. The Queen's Dragoon Guards had a head start on the 1st Hildemede Hussars, but the Hussars had the advantage of speed. They swept past the Queen's Dragoon Guards and headlong into the Westward Horse Guards, and once more the Westward Horse Guards held their line and drove the Hussars back. And now the bugles of the Westward Horse Guards sounded, and the Earl of Westward's heavy cavalry sprang forward, charging into the confused ranks of the retreating 1st Hildemede Hussars, putting them to the sword. Captain Butterfield was not a man to stand idle and watch his fellow Hussars be slaughtered. Even as the Westward Horse Guards were shattering and scattering the last remnants of the 1st Hussars, Captain Butterfield led the 2nd Hussars headlong into their midst. And this time the slashing sabres of the Hussars won the victory. Weakened by their previous exertions, the Westward Horse Guards broke and ran. The Earl of Westward sat astride his horse and watched the final unravelling of all his hopes and dreams. He remained immobile as the last of his surviving horse guards fled past him, and the line of pink-clad Hussars reformed before him. Alone he waited until Captain Butterfield and a small group of Hussars rode up to him and invited him to surrender. Silently he handed his sword to the captain and accepted his fate. Honour had been served. Thus ended the Battle of Fernberg Farm. But at that very moment Queen Ophelia heard the sound of hooves behind her, and up the track and out of the forest galloped a horse bearing a dusty rider, a rider who rode up to Ophelia and handed her an envelope marked with King Ludwig's seal. Ophelia opened the letter from her husband and quickly scanned it. She shook her head and gently sighed. But a woman's work is never done, and a queen's least of all.